And we're live, folks, on Halloween. Joe's Writers Club, JWC Sublimated Poesy with Ricky and David, the poet. And here we are on All Hallows Eve. Happy to all those out there who are celebrating in the old way or the new way. I used to be filled with the Halloween spirit when I was a lad. I had quite a catastrophic addiction to Halloween candy that never quite left. I don't know if I'm as much connected to the spirit of things, but I dig on horror. And the spirit of autumn, the spirit of fall, as you know, the year is on its way to completing itself. It is a magical time for me, one of my favorite times of the year. So, and we cut pumpkins the other day. I mean, it's where it's at, man. With me, it was all about trick-or-treating and the mythos of trick-or-treating. When I was a kid, I used to think like, well, what would stop actual monsters from dressing up? Like, what would stop an actual creature like a cryptid from putting a costume on and going out and getting candy? You know, so I looked over everybody suspiciously as if they could possibly not be human. So there was an added adventure the way I looked at it. But that's, you know, that's me. I don't know. David Anderson is here with us. David, how are you today on this happy Halloween, by the way?
Happy Halloween. I'm doing fine. Actually, I would counter it and say that Halloween is the one night of year where the monsters and the creatures of the night become normal and the humans are the abnormal.
Yeah,
so it's
well,
actually my favorite holiday.
The humans are pretending to be what they already are. Is that what you're saying? I like that take.
Yes, most definitely. There's a very funny episode of the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where we learn that that's the one night of the year that the Slayer doesn't have to work because the monsters find it too offensive to their sensibilities to go out on that night. So that's the one night children are the safest is on Halloween.
Okay, well, hey.
I always thought that was a very amusing take on it. To me, Halloween has always been about expressing the personality that is at odds with society and what is considered normal. So people are permitted to dress up and fantasize and be something that they're not. They're encouraged to, actually. And as a political statement, I think it's very important that we encourage that activity, that people should be allowed. It's another form of free speech in that it's a form of free expression. So it's very important that people go out, and I don't care if you're 20 or 30 years old, if you can get away with it, dress up and see if you can go out there and get some goddamn candy, okay?
All right. You heard it here, folks. And surprisingly, it wasn't from me. A direct command from David Anderson to go get your candy. And look, far be it from me to argue with the man. He knows better, I think. He's got a handle on this. I remember I stopped trick-or-treating when the mothers started to run, when I was too tall, too big, and they were like, what is that? Because my costumes were creepy. So yeah, but if you can get away with it, hey, you know, David's got a point, as always. He's got a useful life hack for you. So yeah, it's Halloween. I haven't been writing anything especially horrific. What I have been doing, though, is as far as creativity, I've been working on a book, Chiron 6. It's a science fiction book. About halfway done with it, and I'm enjoying the heck out of it. And I'm also writing this book called Athenium with David Anderson, our co-host. And that book is, I'm enjoying the heck out of that book too. It's a fantasy, mythic fantasy to do with pirates, and other themes, and just throwing down chapters and talking concepts and stuff. It's like it's been a blast, man. I don't know. Is it heresy? I guess I'm taking this Halloween off. Usually I write something spooky. Last horror story I wrote was on Valentine's Day or whatever. So that day has always been horrific for me. David, how about you, man? How's your creative life been going lately?
Well, the primary focus is the Athenaeum novel that I'm writing with you, but I've been outlining two different books. One is called Billy, and the other is called The Ghost. And I'm also writing short fiction too, so, and poetry. So it's just, I really don't have enough time to write it all. And that's a good position to be in, is to have so many ideas flowing. And if you find the right environment, that's what I always advise everyone. Find a regular time if you can. It's not always easy in the modern way we organize our life, but if you can, find an early hour morning or a late evening morning, depending on your preference, and just start writing. And that's your special hour. The poetess Emily Dickinson always wrote between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m. when there was the least amount of noise and distraction. And the poetess Sylvia Plath also wrote early in the morning before the milkman delivered his milk, and before the children were up. So there's always a time that you can find an hour. If that involves giving up an hour on social media, I think that's a good way to improve your life right there, just for that alone. So definitely write. Just even if you're going to write a list of words, even if you tear it up when you're finished with it, you have written, and that is there. The payoff for that is just you can't even begin to calculate the payoff in just writing.
That's right, folks. Episodic satisfaction through creative obsession. Write every chance you get. If you're a writer, if you're creative, it's instinctual to reach into the transcendent force of creativity. Take time out of your day and write something, just like David's saying. What does Stephen King say? He says 1,000 words a day. 1,000 words a day. So even if you were half as bold and you wrote 500, you could write 500 words a day. We don't need Mr. Rogers to tell us we can do that. We can do that. So all you got to do is do that a couple years, and you're gonna have something. You just keep throwing it down. And David knows as much as I do the benefits, how it's therapeutic, purges stress from the body, gives you something to reposition the Atlantean globe on your back, the heft of the weight of the world. Help yourself and put it down for a moment. That's what creativity does in the Jungian sense, meditation spaces and so forth. We're always writing, every day a little something. I plan on writing a little bit later, I hope. It's been a busy day, so. Anyway, well, that was a fantastic creative check-in. The old Halloween greeting. I just remember going out and getting pillowcases of candy when I was a kid, and the joy and mystery of going out with your friends among crackling leaves and autumn breezes, questing for mystery in neighborhoods, looking for candy, being a goose on mischief night. It's a wonderful tradition. So today, our poetry read. is The Vampire by Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire was beloved by the Beats, by certain rock stars in the 60s. And this one I've always liked, although it's been many years since I've read it. Felt it appropriate today, being that it's Halloween for you Halloweenies out there. And so here we go. The Vampire by Charles Baudelaire, the poet. You who, like the stab of a knife, entered my plaintive heart, you who, strong as a herd of demons, came ardent and adorned to make your bed and your domain of my humiliated mind. Infamous bitch, to whom I'm bound, like the convict to his chain, like the stubborn gambler to the game, like the drunkard to his wine, like the maggots to the corpse. Accursed be you. I beg the swift poignard to gain for me my liberty. I asked perfidious poison to give aid to my cowardice. Alas, both poison and the knife contemptuously said to me, you do not deserve to be freed from your accursed slavery. Fool! If from her domination our efforts could deliver you, your kisses would resuscitate the cadaver of your vampire. Now, that was very exciting, as I remember. And it's the very nature. I don't know a lot about this poem. It's a beautiful, exciting piece of verse, I'd say. Wonderful. Pace tells a little story of sorts, but it wanders nicely, mystified, like poetry should be, especially from then. What do you think? What did you think of the read, David? And what do you think of this poem?
I thought the read was fine. I think the poem is more about the poet than it is the subject. It's about his addiction to a particular woman, his love, or in the case, it may be appropriate to say lust for a particular woman that's led him into what is obviously the poet considers an unhealthy, immoral situation for him to be in. And he's cursing his the power that she holds over him, the sway that she holds over him. And so to me, it's about sexual lust and desire, and how it can destroy the free will of the thinking mind. But that's a very one-tracked interpretation, obviously. We could read it literally as an actual love poem to a vampire. And then that opens it up to the horror side even more. So we could say this is much like Anne Rice perspective of a love-hate relationship between the vampire who sires an offspring and creates a new vampire, and enjoys the liberty and the sensual desire and lust for all that brings, but is also cursed forever in this situation, bound to that lust, I guess. That's how I would interpret it. It's sort of a very moralistic interpretation. The nice thing about poetry, I always say, is that someone can tell me that I'm an idiot and I don't understand what I'm talking about, and then I would be delighted to hear their opinion, because I don't think there is such a thing as one correct interpretation of a poem. I think there are just interpretations, and that it becomes a new poem for each reader.
Yeah, I think that it's applicable to say that the first interpretation that you mentioned, that's logical, that he's dressing up someone as in the archetype of the vampire, as the vampire is known through folklore, because again, this is from quite some time ago. But it's as known through folklore, and it's as known through reputation, and even in media, I'm assuming by that point. But these things were all over Europe. So he's calling her, whatever she is, a monster. If she is a monster, or if he's calling her a monster, he's clothing her in a monstrous archetype. And that's something to be said about poetry, isn't it? The way that he clothes her in the guise of a vampire, so that he's describing her monstrosity in his eyes and his own powerlessness in the shadow of such monstrosity. And it's frustrating him. That's why he's cursing her. Or she is a supernatural being, like you say, secondly, right?
Right. I mean, I can literally come up with a half a dozen very fantastical interpretations. And my use of the word fantastical is not a pejorative in any way. It's just letting the mind go wild and free. I could say that this is Charles Baudelaire in love with a courtesan who dresses in a very vampish way, or he imagines her as being a vampire that has drawn him in with her beauty. So that's a very popular route to go. It's not my route for the vampire. That's why when I suggested the fiction part, I want other people to see the other side. These are working together because in both cases, the vampires are women, but also vampires are, let's not forget, vampires are monsters. They are corruptors of nature in the natural world and the creation of God. So they are actually forces of evil. No matter how much we dress them up, there's always too great a price to romanticize them. That's why I prefer Nosferatu to Dracula.
And with that in mind, folks, now that we've gone over this poem and we've explained the nature of what the poet can do, he can dress you up in the guise of a monster. He can paint you a monster and express himself and mystify the entire situation with a poem. So that was a more subtle vampire. That was the archetype of the vampire. But now what we're moving on to is, as always, our prose piece. We do a poem and then we do a prose piece, and we try to give you the wordplay of the poem as well as the voice fulfillment of the prose. That is to say, what is poetic in the prose section. So today, going to read for good old Halloween a chapter of Salem's Lot by Stephen King. We already did a Stephen King show, but we're super jonesed. And in this instance, it's the question of the subtle vampire versus the gross vampire. And no one who's read this book or who has seen this movie can forget various vampire scenes that are in it. I know as a boy, they certainly thrilled me into insomnia, which is their purpose. So today we're going to hit chapter 14 of Salem's Lot by Stephen King. It says part 15. Not sure what's going on there, but I'm assuming it's formatting. So here we go. Beyond the table, where the letter had been propped, the cellar made an L turn. They were now in what was once had been a wine cellar. Hubert Markston must have been a bootlegger indeed, Ben thought. There were small and medium casks covered with dust and cobwebs. One wall was covered with a crisscross wine rack, and ancient magnums still peered forth from some of the diamond-shaped pigeonholes. Some of them had exploded, and where sparkling burgundy had once waited for some discerning palate, the spider now made his home. Others had undoubtedly turned to vinegar. The sharp odor drifted in the air, mingled with that of slow corruption. No, Ben said, speaking quietly, as a man speaks a fact. I can't. You must, Father Callahan said. I'm not telling you it will be easy or for the best, only that you must. I can't, Ben cried. This time the words echoed in the cellar. In the center, on a raised dais, and spotlighted by Jimmy's flashlight, Susan Norton lay still. She was covered from shoulder to feet in a drift of simple white linen. When they reached her, none of them had been able to speak. Wonder had swallowed words. In life, she had been a cheerfully pretty girl who had missed the turn to beauty somewhere, perhaps by inches, not through any lack in features, but just possibly because her life had been so calm and unremarkable. But now she had achieved beauty, dark beauty. Death had not put its mark on her. Her blushed with color, and her lips, innocent of makeup, were a deep and glowing red. Her forehead was pale but flawless, the skin like cream. Her eyes were closed, and the dark lashes lay sootily against her cheeks. One hand was curled at her side, and the other was thrown lightly across her waist. Yet the total impression was not of angelic loveliness, but a cold, disconnected beauty. Something in her face, not sated, but hinted at, made Jimmy think of the young Saigon girls, some not yet 13, who would kneel before soldiers in the alley behind the bars, not for the first time or the 100th. Yet with those girls, the corruption had been evil, but only a knowledge of the world that had come too soon. The change in Susan's face was quite different, but he could not have said just how. Now Callahan stepped forward, pressed his fingers against the springiness of her left breast. Here, he said, the heart. No, Ben repeated, I can't. Be your lover, Father Callahan said softly. Better be her husband. You won't hurt her, Ben. You'll free her. The only one hurt will be you. Ben looked at him dumbly. Mark had taken the steak from Jimmy's black bag and held it out wordlessly. Ben took it in a hand that seemed to stretch out for miles. If I don't think about it when I do it, then maybe. But it would be impossible not to think about it. And suddenly a line came to him from Dracula, that amusing bit of fiction that no longer amused him in the slightest. It was Van Helsing's speech to Arthur Holmwood, when Arthur had been faced with the same dreadful task. We must go through bitterness. We must go through bitter waters before we reach the sweet. Could there be a sweetness for any of them ever again? Take it away, he groaned. Don't make me do this. No answer. He felt cold, sick sweat sprang out on his brow, his cheeks, his forearms. The steak that had been a simple baseball bat 4 hours before seemed infused with eerie heaviness, as if invisible yet titanic lines of force had converged on it. He lifted the steak and pressed it against her left breast, just above the last fastened button of her blouse. The point made a dimple in her flesh, and he felt the side of his mouth begin to twitch in an uncontrollable tick. She's not dead, he said. His voice was hoarse and thick. It was his last line of defense. No, Jimmy said implacably. She's undead, Ben. She had shown him. He had shown them, had wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her still arm and pumped it. The reading had been 0/0. He had put his stethoscope on her chest, and each of them had listened to the silence inside her. Something was put into Ben's other hand. Years later, he still did not remember which of them had put it there. The hammer. the craftsman hammer with the rubber perforated grip. The head glimmered and the flashlight's glow. "Do it quickly," Callahan said, "and go out into the daylight. We'll do the rest." "We must go through bitter waters before we reach the sweet." "God forgive me," Ben whispered. He raised the hammer and brought it down. The hammer struck the top of the stake squarely, and the gelatinous tremor that vibrated up the length of ash would haunt him forever in his dreams. Her eyes flew open, wide and blue, as if from the very force of the blow. Blood gushed upward from the stake's point of entry in a bright and astonishing flood, splashing his hands, his shirt, his cheeks. In an instant, the cellar was filled with its hot, coppery odor. She writhed on the table. Her hands came up and beat madly at the air like birds. Her feet thumped an aimless, rattling tattoo on the wood of the platform. Her mouth yawned open, revealing shocking, wolf-like fangs, and she began to peal forth shriek after shriek, like hell's clarion. Blood gushed from the corners of her mouth in freshets. The hammer rose and fell, again, again, again. Ben's brain was filled with the shrieks of large black crows. It whirled with awful, unremembered images. His hands were scarlet, the stake was scarlet. The remorselessly rising and falling hammer was scarlet. In Jimmy's trembling hands, the flashlight became stroboscopic, illuminating Susan's crazed, lashing face in spurts and flashes. Her teeth sheared through the flesh of her lips, tearing them to ribbons. Blood splattered across the fresh linen sheet, which Jimmy had so neatly turned back, making patterns like Chinese ideograms. Then, suddenly, her back arched like a bow, and her mouth stretched open until it seemed her jaws must break. A huge explosion of darker blood issued forth from the wound the stake had made, almost black in this chancy lunatic light, heart's blood. The scream that welled from the sounding chamber of that gaping mouth came from all the subcellars of the deepest race memory and beyond that, to the moist darkness of the human soul. Blood suddenly boiled from her mouth and nose in a tide, and something else. In the faint light, it was only a suggestion, a shadow of something leaping up and out, cheated and ruined, merged with the darkness and was gone. She settled back, her mouth relaxing, closing, the mangled lips parted in a last susurrating pulse of air. For a moment, the eyelids fluttered, and Ben saw, or fancied he saw, the Susan he had met in the park, reading his book. It was done. Backed away, dropping the hammer, holding his hand out before him, a terrified conductor whose symphony has run riot. Callahan put a hand on his shoulder. "Ben," he fled. He stumbled going up the stairs, fell, and crawled toward the light at the top. Childhood horror and adult horror had merged. If he looked over his shoulder, he would see hubby Marston, or perhaps Straker, only a hand's breadth behind, grinning out of his puffed and greenish face, the rope embedded deep into his neck, the grin revealing fangs instead of teeth. He screamed once, miserably. Dimly he heard Callahan cry out, "No, let him go." He burst through the kitchen and out the back door. The back porch steps were gone under his feet, and he pitched headlong into the dirt. He got to his knees, crawled, got to his feet, and cast a glance behind him. Nothing. The house loomed without purpose. The last of its evil stolen away. It was just a house again. Ben Mayer stood in the great silence of the weed-choked backyard, his head thrown back, breathing in great white snuffles of air. That was a fantastic passage. And me, as a kid, I dug Vampire Hunters special. I wanted to be one for 10 minutes until I like figured out Ghostbusters, you know? It's either that or Werewolf Hunter, Monster Hunter, Ghost Hunter. It was all chill for me. But movies like Salem's Lot and like Fright Night, you know, they really got me. They got me jonesed to be a vampire hunter, and that's what this reflects. This is really the classic struggle of the vampire hunter, which is the vehicle that the vampire spirit is in is formerly human. And if you have a human tie to what is now a monster, there's a disorientation there that your moral compass, it begins to cloud what must be done. Because what must be done is so monstrous and horrifying that it rivals the very thing you're trying to eliminate. But it's a necessity. And this guy, you know, Father Callahan, he's got the right of it. When you got that kind of thing in undeath, what are you supposed to do? You know, for the rest of the humanity around you, you have few options, because if it gets away, it will go on doing what it does. You know, we could pretend we have sympathies for vampires in fiction. We could pretend we have sympathies for darklings. But if they were really in our neighborhoods, taking up residence and doing what they do, being a predator like they are, you would seek with all force to eliminate them, because otherwise it's like, forget it. There's no peace. I got to reread. Clearly, I have to reread Salem's Lot because it's been too long. Because that was delicious. That whole thing. David, what did you think of the read, and what have you to say about the passage?
The read was fine. I would say that the passage, I chose that one because there was a romantic connection between the vampire hunter and the vampire.
Yep.
And there's a similar connection of erotic tension between the poet and the vampire in the poem. And I think that there's an interesting parallel there. But what I find really interesting about the Stephen King's version of a vampire is he's doing something that you don't typically see in vampire literature. He's presenting it as sort of I would say like a virus almost, the story, that it can infect communities and spread from neighborhood to neighborhood. And that for that reason it's not even so much a moral or you're not going at war against evil so much in the traditional moral sense, but just it's almost like you're trying to stop a disease from taking root. And in a time of pandemics, maybe this story would be good for people to read this story and understand. I'm not making any political statements here. I'm just drawing some parallels. But what I like best about the story is that the master vampire, Kurt Barlow, is just a monster. There's nothing romantic or something that a teenage girl could fall in love with. Young men wouldn't aspire to be him because he's just a killing machine. He's just pure evil. And I like those kinds of representations in horror sometimes. They don't always have to be that way, but King wrote this very well, I would say.
Yes, I would say so too. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it immensely. There is something monstrous about disease and vampires, the way that they take over communities. I mean, again, it's more founded in predation, but there is something of an affliction, a commonality of affliction, because of the transformative effect of the inevitable that the vampire represents. Vampires that have long contact with something will either make it dead or undead in the eventuality. So it's an inevitable conversion or termination, which is, it fits the symmetry of a disease, or again, what afflicts. So you can be afflicted by a vampire, yes. And I think that's what you're getting at there, which I agree. And why there are vampire hunters, why they have to go out and do what they do. Because there's something about the association with a force that drains your energy, that takes vitality from you, that robs opportunity and redirects your life in some way. Again, following the path of afflictions and the afflicted, and what the vampire does to the living soul. Perfectly portrayed in the text. Wonderful. Gotta reread Salem's Lot, folks. That's what that boils down to.
I mean, to me, a monster. That's one. I have a beef with particular writers and their romanticizing of vampires. I won't go into it because I know the one I'm thinking of, she has a huge fan base, and I won't utter her name in this work, in this space, because I don't want to upset people. But I have a huge beef with the idea of romanticizing and eroticizing a monster to the point that it's no longer a monster and it's just a misunderstood lover. To me, vampires are always monsters and killing machines. I mean, this states it very well in the Stephen King text that when Ben looks at Susan, she's no longer there. It's something completely different. She may have possessed a new kind of beauty, but it's a false beauty. It's a front. It's a mask for the evil that's underneath. There's no soul there. There's no humanity. So we could explore that as a metaphor, actually, and that would be very fascinating. And what do you think about that idea?
Well, the vampiric condition certainly dehumanizes the subject. So that's the very nature. One of the underpinnings behind being an affliction is that you're dehumanized when they put you away, either a quarantine or they're doing an experimental treatment. They have to treat you with such specialty that you're not accorded the same rights, the same this, the same that. So yeah, it makes sense. It does. It's the same thing that's being conveyed, and I agree. Yeah. It's just, there's something about I mean, we're focusing on the vampire, but it's also for me, it was always the concept of the vampire hunter. If you're a hunter and you're going out to fell game, to feed your family, or because there's a menace that needs to be dealt with in your community, whatever it is, yeah, there's a certain amount of gumption, that you got to have in order to go out and terminate something. But that's
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm curious. What's your favorite version of Dracula in film adaptation?
Oh, it's hard to say. I love the Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman. I love the old Lugosi film,
right?
Like Death. But it boils down to the overall concept of the vampire. For me, doesn't need Dracula. I mean, I dig Dracula as a concept, and I love what they've done with that entity over the years. But it's the nature of I wonder at what it is to be a vampire, especially an old and powerful one. If you watch them in some fiction, sometimes they're hundreds, sometimes thousands of years old, like in Underworld or Vampire Hunter D. They get old and mighty. And then they seem like they're going to be difficult to deal with. But it's getting back to the hunter thing. It's like a hunter that hunts natural things, that is a hunter in nature, that's fearsome enough. But to hunt a supernatural thing like a vampire, which thinks, is ferocious like an animal, but thinks and self-preserves and makes booby traps and familiars, and it's much more dangerous than hunting anything in nature. So what must it take, to like get up and realize, yeah, we're going to go find this monster and we're going to end it. That's really something. If it be Van Helsing and Dracula, or if it be any of these hunters that you see in fiction, even going back to Blade and whatever. I watched lots of vampire flicks, and I read some of the fiction, but yeah, it's an amazing thing to confront the mythos of it. And I think we've gotten some great examples here of, in the poem, there was a subtle, what's the way, a costume or an attribute of the vampire, where he's making her into a monster. But then we have this monster and the unmaking of the monster in the text, where he's looking at her and he has the childhood memories of her humanity, and how he has to kill what is already dead. Think about how pleasant that must have been.
That's an itch. I wanted to comment on that, actually. But before I do that, I wanted to comment on the Van Helsing. The creation of Van Helsing is a unique heroic type, in that it's a hero that exists exclusively to hunt and destroy evil. How many hero types can we list that are like Van Helsing? That's why he's become he actually is the dominant character and force in the Dracula novel. And the adaptation by Coppola, I am very fond of, so I agree that's one of my favorites.
Yes.
And there's a very amusing scene where, after they kill a vampire, I think it's Lucy is killed, and he then takes Arthur and the group out to dinner, and he's eating heartily a very bloody roast and drinking ale, and they are all sitting back, and none of them they have all lost their appetite. But it really shows the kind of that was just very well portrayed and well written in that one example. But the other question was, I'm sorry, refresh my memory. What was the other question?
Well, we were talking about the subtle clothing of the vampire versus the monster, the monster, and then the humanity emerging out of the monster. Right.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Well, I was going to say that King creates a really special thing in this short amount of space, in that Ben, when he talks about Ben having this memory for the rest of his life, that brings on questions like, well, he's going to have trauma from this. It will haunt him for the rest of his life,
I'd say.
I mean, how many authors have taken on the psychic damage, the psychological damage, rather, that and the trauma that this can leave on someone, especially if it's a young man and he's probably very sensitive, and he's in love with this girl. I mean, that's kind of a really messed up thing to ask someone to ask a young man to do. Like that's like cold. That's stone cold playing.
Callahan knows how difficult it is, but it needs to be done. So
right, yeah. So that was really fun.
Yeah, because he was using his love of her to destroy the monster. He was using the memories that saw her as a human to, when he sees her in this monstrous form, he's like, well, if you want to save that human, that being, the human being you loved, you have to destroy this monster that she's become. That's the very crux, the core of the vampire problem is it takes good men and it makes them have to question everything in order to do what is right. What does it say in the movie Bram Stoker's Dracula? I don't know if this is in the text, but he says something after the slaying of Lucy. He says, we're all God's madman, you know, like, in other words, we're doing what has to be done, but we feel like it's insane that we have to do these things, you know.
I think part of my problem with the romanticization of the vampire, that was something that was created by Stoker himself in writing the novel. Before that, vampire tales were just about destroying evil monsters, killing machines. Yep. And he created a very theatrical, a narrative that had a lot of theatric possibilities. And I guess, how shall I put it? Genre possibilities. So he laid the groundwork for other writers after him to explore the eroticization of vampires, romancing them, taking what was traditionally viewed as a monster and trying to make it human again by giving it the capacity to fall in love and have a conscience and all of these other matters, which really kind of clouds the water. So I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. What I'm saying is that it has in the minds of certain people who are not very well read or who are just looking for thrills, they can lose the reality and the truth of what we're talking about in going after. I mean, take Interview for a Vampire. This is a character that is the reason that the novel is so famous, and justly so, is because she's created a monster who has just terrible guilt, you know, just can't cope with what he's chosen to do. So that's all well and good. And it's very good for young women to fall in love with the sexy vampire on the screen, but it doesn't really. Then you have to tap them on the shoulder and you have to say, "I'm sorry, I don't want to be, you know, a killjoy, but this is a monster still." Because there's a certain point, I think, where people do that. They romanticize it out of what the whole. I mean, this is still a monster, right? I mean,
wow.
Am I making too much of that point, or? I'm kind of curious to hear other people's opinion.
Well, look, man, I mean, I think what we did with this show by showing the subtle versus the gross, there's this woman who's being turned into a vampire, and then there's a vampire we're recalling when she was still human. And the question with the vampires, where does the monster begin and end, you know? I don't necessarily dislike the monstrous vampire, and I furthermore, I don't think that Anne Rice's vampires are devoid of monstrosity. I think when you read them, they're still monsters, but they have a glamour. The way that there are majestic cats or certain reptiles that have a certain beauty about them, but they're deadly killers, you know? That I feel like that. I mean, because if you listen to the way she describes the killing, in one hand, and as the series goes on, it becomes less about monstrosity and more about reveling in her vampirehood that she's created. But in the beginning, there's still plenty, at least in my opinion, in Interview with the Vampire, Vampire Lestat, Queen of the Damned, there's still plenty of monster left in those. I like the nebulous exploration of where the monster begins and ends. If there's nothing but a beast or an unreliable creature that can't be trusted for anything, or is like, because that's the thing. There are vampires in fiction that are like they're Dempeel or half breeds, and it's like some of them seem to have a choice. Like some of them are like that vampire light. They don't want to be evil. Forever Night and Angel and all that racket. Some of them are they're looking for some kind of redeeming quality.
Yeah,
I
I like Buffy, okay? I really do. And I don't mind that she falls in love with the vampire, but that's like a problem for someone who hasn't lived in the world and accepted the world for what it is. In my opinion, it's fantasy. It's like it's a very high form of fantasy, and I just find it's not appealing to myself, and I'm happy to admit that I have a prejudice against it. So I'll be delighted if someone will say, "Well, you've got it completely wrong, David. You don't know what you're talking about." Because I do, I love a good debate. But to me, my favorite vampire is Nosferatu. Just foul, evil, putridness. There are passages in the Stephen King where he talks about the stench of the vampire's lair. It's just that'll take the romance, that'll kill the romance right away. Just the foul odor of rotting corpses and rats and death. So that's a side that I think certain writers, and it's just not Anne Rice. Okay, I mean this has been going on since, like I said, since Stoker wrote his masterpiece. So he created the problem. It's not Anne Rice's fault. She just took it to the extreme. She did what every she's a great writer. Okay, she took it to the extreme. She stole something and she made it wonderful. So I'm not calling her a bad writer in any sense of the word.
No, you got your Anne Rice vampires, you got your Stephen King vampires, right. You got your, it's like there's plenty of room at the buffet for all these different kinds. So that was cool, man. How do you make your monster? That's the name of the game here. Is it that you're clothing someone in the vampire, or is it a vampire with the vestiges of humanity? Remember these tricks, folks, when you're writing monsters. How do you want the monster to be situated as a matter of spirit, so that the person knows either doom or enchantment or whatever it is? It makes for an interesting topic to go over, to say the very least.
I think I've gotten this show into trouble, so I would like to apologize to all Anne Rice fans that I'm just a guy with an opinion. Ricky is just the host, and I'm going to Ricky, I apologize to you too. I don't want to get you into any trouble, because I know she has a legion of fans out there that would happily crucify me for what is essentially sacrilege, and they might be justified in saying that.
I think her fan base is more reasonable than that. At least I'm hoping so. But you don't have to apologize to me. We're just making a point here, folks. It's like there are subtle vampires and there are monstrous, terrible, gross vampires.
Right.
And which one do you prefer? Leave some comments and let us know. And because this is Halloween. I mean, if we can't talk about vampires today, when are we going to talk about vampires, right? And as always, the show just flies by. Time flies when you're having fun, when you're creating something cool. And I enjoyed the heck out of this show. We learned something new. It's been great. Please do, since this is JWC Livestream, that's Joe's Writers Club Livestream. JWC Sublimated Poesy with Ricky and David. Please go to joeswritersclub.com. Go to joeswriters.club, our forums. Head over to our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and especially our YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We need numbers. And head over and check us out. And we had a great time bringing the show to you. You have a happy Halloween. David, you have a happy Halloween yourself, man.
Yeah,
Thanks
you
for
too,
coming
man.
on. Yeah.
Yeah. Happy Halloween.
All right, folks. See you next time.